Between November 3rd and November 28th, 1933, 14 federal revenue agents disappeared across a 40-mile stretch of eastern Kentucky mountains during enforcement operations targeting illegal whiskey production in Pike County, vanishing from their patrol routes, their surveillance positions, their vehicles abandoned on isolated roads, where they'd been investigating moonshine operations allegedly run by the White family, whose patriarch Thomas White had been shot dead by revenue agent Marcus Webb during raid on November 2nd that had been conducted without warrant and had resulted in death of unarmed man defending his property from what he'd believed were armed robbers rather than federal officers whose identification had been concealed until after fatal shooting. By December 1st, all 14 were dead, their bodies discovered in locations deliberately chosen to mark every site where revenue agents had trespassed on White family property during 3 years of harassment and illegal surveillance, where officers had stolen equipment and destroyed stills without legal authority, where federal agents had terrorized mountain community through violence and intimidation that had culminated in Thomas White's murder. The perpetrator was Rosa White, 41-year-old widow and mother of 4, who'd watched federal agents shoot her husband through heart while he'd been unarmed and attempting only to protect his home from men who'd burst onto property without announcing themselves as law enforcement, who'd spent 26 days systematically hunting every agent involved in raid and subsequent cover-up, that had ruled shooting justified despite witnesses confirming Thomas had been murdered while surrendering. The Treasury Department would classify it as deadliest attack on revenue agents by single individual in American history. Unprecedented case where mountain woman had eliminated entire enforcement team that had killed her husband and had terrorized her community through systematic violations of constitutional protections and basic decency. But motive wasn't simple revenge or protection of criminal enterprise. It was widow delivering justice that legal system had denied, proving that revenue badges provided no protection against woman defending family honor, and demonstrating that systematic violations of mountain families' rights would cost federal government more agents than they were willing to sacrifice when victims' survivors possessed knowledge of terrain and willingness to use violence that male agents had never anticipated from woman they dismissed as harmless widow grief-stricken by husband's death. If you're ready to hear how Mountain Widow became deadliest woman in federal law enforcement history, systematically eliminating 14 revenue agents who'd killed her husband, hit that subscribe button. But understand this story contains dramatized account of systematic violence by woman against federal agents during Prohibition's final year when revenue enforcement had become particularly aggressive and civil liberties violations were routine practice justified by war on illegal alcohol. Pike County, Kentucky occupied 789 square miles of coal country and mountain hollows in 1933, wedged between Virginia and West Virginia borders, populated by 65,000 people, mostly working mines or producing illegal whiskey during Prohibition's final year before repeal, would eliminate criminal penalties for alcohol production and sale. The county was notorious for moonshine, estimated that over 2,000 families operated stills, producing corn whiskey, that supplied distributors throughout eastern United States, generated income that sustained mountain economy when coal mining provided insufficient employment, and when legal alternatives barely existed during Depression that had devastated national economy. November 1933 meant temperatures dropping into 30s at night, bare trees offering little cover for still operations that required concealment from federal revenue agents who'd intensified enforcement during Prohibition's final months, apparently determined to maximize arrests before repeal eliminated justification for positions and budgets that had sustained federal alcohol enforcement bureaucracy. Rosa White had lived in Pike County since birth in 1892, descended from Scots-Irish settlers who'd arrived in Kentucky mountains before Revolutionary War, raised learning traditional mountain skills, including hunting and tracking and medicinal herb preparation that made her respected healer throughout region. She'd married Thomas White in 1910 at age 18, had raised 4 children, 3 sons and daughter, on homestead where family grew corn and vegetables while Thomas operated small, still producing perhaps 50 gallons monthly for local consumption, Modest operation that generated supplementary income but wasn't commercial enterprise threatening revenue collections. Thomas was 44 in 1933, had operated still for 20 years, without serious interference from local law enforcement, who understood moonshining was economic necessity rather than criminal enterprise, had been universally respected in community as honest man who paid debts and helped neighbors, and never caused trouble beyond producing whiskey that everyone in Pike County drank, regardless of Prohibition's federal prohibition. The trouble began in 1930, when federal revenue enforcement was reorganized under new supervisor named Marcus Webb, 38-year-old agent, transferred from Chicago where he'd worked against organized crime bootleggers, brought aggressive urban tactics to rural Kentucky, where he believed mountain moonshiners deserved same treatment as Al Capone's organization, despite fundamental differences between family operations, sustaining subsistence economies, and criminal enterprises generating millions in profits through violence and corruption. Webb established enforcement strategy focused on destroying equipment and terrorizing families rather than simply arresting operators who'd be quickly replaced, believed that making moonshining unprofitable through systematic property destruction would eliminate illegal production more effectively than prosecutions that resulted in minimal fines and brief jail terms that mountain families accepted as cost of doing business. Webb's campaign against white family began in 1931 when informant reported Thomas operated still on his property. Intelligence that was accurate, but that led to enforcement operation that violated constitutional protections and basic decency. Revenue agents conducted surveillance without warrant, trespassed on property repeatedly to monitor operations, ultimately raided Homestead in March 1931 without proper legal authority, destroying Thomas's still and seizing copper equipment worth approximately $200 that represented significant investment for family with limited resources. Thomas hadn't resisted raid, had cooperated fully once agents identified themselves, had accepted loss of equipment as unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of producing illegal whiskey. But agents' behavior during raid had been unnecessarily aggressive, several officers making threatening comments to Rosa and her daughter Sarah about what would happen to women whose men couldn't protect them from federal authority. Implicit sexual threats that mountain families understood meant more than simple harassment. Thomas rebuilt still in 1932, calculated that continuing production was economic necessity, despite federal harassment, believed that agents' threats had been bluster designed to intimidate rather than genuine warnings of escalated enforcement. But Webb's surveillance continued, agents appearing regularly on white property without warrants or announcements, monitoring families' activities through binoculars from concealed positions, creating atmosphere of constant observation that made Rosa feel violated in her own home, unable to conduct daily activities without knowing federal agents were watching. The surveillance was intimidation tactic rather than legitimate law enforcement, designed to make families abandon moonshining through psychological pressure when legal prosecution proved ineffective deterrent against operations that provided essential income during Depression. The situation escalated in October 1933 when Webb personally visited White Homestead, told Thomas directly that continuing to operate still would result in consequences beyond equipment seizure and fines, that agents would make life unbearable for his family if production continued, that Rosa and daughter Sarah would face prosecution as accomplices if Thomas didn't cease operations immediately. Thomas responded that he'd operated still for over 20 years, that Webb's threats were harassment rather than legitimate enforcement, that family had right to economic survival, that prohibition shouldn't eliminate when legal alternatives didn't exist. Webb's response was barely concealed threat about what happened to mountain men who didn't cooperate with federal authority, implication that accidents could occur during raids when subjects resisted arrest or threatened officers who were simply performing duties that Congress had authorized through legislation criminalizing alcohol production. Thomas understood Webb's visit as warning that violence was imminent, that revenue agents were preparing to escalate beyond property destruction to physical harm that might be justified through false claims of resistance or threats. He discussed situation with Rosa, proposed they might cease production temporarily until Webb's attention shifted to other families, that protecting families' safety was more important than maintaining income from whiskey sales. But Rosa argued that surrendering to Webb's intimidation meant accepting that federal agents could terrorize families without consequences, that backing down would invite continued harassment regardless of whether still operated, that Webb's threats needed to be confronted rather than accommodated, because bullies only respected strength, that demonstrated resistance carried costs they weren't willing to pay. The final confrontation came November 2, 1933, when 4 revenue agents, including Webb, raided White homestead at dawn without warrant or proper announcement, approached property while family was sleeping, burst through door with weapons drawn before anyone could determine who was entering their home. Thomas emerged from bedroom to find armed men in his house, believed they were robbers, or worse given agents' failure to identify themselves, grabbed hunting rifle from rack near door attempting to defend family from what appeared to be home invasion. Webb shot Thomas twice in chest before he could raise rifle, killed him instantly while 3 other agents pointed weapons at Rosa and her children, who'd been awakened by gunfire and shouting, traumatized by watching husband and father murdered in their home by men whose identities as federal officers weren't revealed until after fatal shooting had occurred. Webb's official report filed November 3rd claimed Thomas had threatened agents with rifle during legitimate enforcement operation, that shooting had been justified self-defense when subject had resisted lawful authority, that agents had properly identified themselves before entering property, and that Thomas's aggressive response had necessitated lethal force to protect officers' lives. The report was fabrication from beginning to end. Witnesses from neighboring properties confirmed agents had never announced themselves as federal officers, that shooting had occurred within seconds of forced entry before Thomas could have understood who was invading his home. That rifle had been grabbed defensively rather than raised threateningly, that Thomas had been shot while still trying to determine what was happening, rather than while resisting identified federal authority. But Treasury Department accepted Webb's account without investigation, ruled shooting justified within 24 hours, despite witnesses contradicting official version, closed case without interviewing Rosa or her children who'd witnessed murder, without examining whether agents had possessed warrant authorizing forced entry at dawn without proper announcement. Rosa buried her husband November 4th in cemetery on Homestead, where his ancestors had been buried for over a century, surrounded by over 200 mourners from throughout Pike County, who understood Thomas had been murdered by revenue agent who'd been terrorizing families for 3 years, who'd finally escalated harassment to lethal violence when Thomas had refused to be intimidated into surrendering economic survival to federal agents' campaign of terror. Multiple witnesses at funeral approached Rosa privately, described their own experiences with Webb's aggressive tactics, detailed how agents had stolen property and destroyed equipment beyond what was legally authorized, how Webb personally had made threatening comments about what happened to mountain families, who didn't cooperate with federal enforcement that protected American public from dangerous alcohol that everyone in Pike County produced and consumed without incident. Rosa made decision at graveside that Webb's murder of her husband wouldn't go unpunished, that federal government's refusal to investigate, despite witness testimony, meant justice required actions outside legal system that had failed to hold agents accountable for systematic violations of constitutional rights and basic human decency. She was 41 years old, mother of 4 including 3 adult sons who offered to avenge their father's death through violence against revenue agents. But Rosa insisted she would handle retribution personally, that her sons had families and futures that shouldn't be sacrificed to vengeance that she could deliver herself. That mountain widow mourning murdered husband would be underestimated by male federal agents, who'd never anticipate systematic campaign of elimination that she'd been planning since moment she'd watched Webb shoot Thomas through heart, while he'd been defending family from what appeared to be armed home invasion. Rosa's advantages were numerous, despite Webb's assumption that grieving widow posed no threat to federal enforcement operations. She knew Pike County mountains intimately from lifetime of hunting and gathering medicinal herbs, understood every trail and hollow, and concealed approach that agents who were outsiders to region would never recognize. She'd learned tracking and hunting from father and husband, could shoot rifle and shotgun with accuracy, that matched any man's capability, possessed patience and attention to detail that hunting had cultivated across decades of providing game meat for families' sustenance. Most significantly, she understood that agents would dismiss her as threat, that mountain men would be suspected of any violence against revenue officers, but that widow would be seen as victim of tragedy rather than perpetrator of systematic elimination campaign that she'd designed to punish every agent involved in Thomas's murder and 3 years of harassment that had preceded it. Rosa's counter-surveillance of revenue operations began November 5th, identifying all 14 agents operating in Pike County, including 4 who'd participated in fatal raid. She documented their routines and patrol patterns, identified where they stayed and what routes they traveled, determined which agents worked alone and which operated in pairs, created detailed intelligence about enforcement operations that would enable her to strike systematically without being caught or identified. Her preparation included studying each agent's background and personality, understanding which were aggressive like Webb and which were simply following orders they'd been assigned, making moral judgments about whether all deserved death or whether some should be spared as reluctant participants in a campaign of terror that Webb had designed and implemented. Rosa decided all 14 would die because all had participated in harassment of mountain families, all had stolen property and destroyed stills without proper warrants. All had contributed to an atmosphere of terror that had culminated in Thomas's murder through their collective willingness to follow Webb's aggressive tactics without questioning whether systematic violations of constitutional rights were justified by congressional prohibition of alcohol. She understood her decision, made her murderer under federal law regardless of whether her victims had themselves violated laws and rights they'd been sworn to protect, but believed that defending family honor and demonstrating consequences of systematic civil rights violations required comprehensive response that eliminated entire enforcement operation rather than simply killing agents directly responsible for Thomas's death. The systematic elimination began November 8th when revenue agent Carl Mitchell was found dead on isolated trail, shot from concealed position by sniper, who disappeared before body was discovered. Mitchell had been one of 4 agents present during fatal raid, had pointed weapon at Rosa and her children while Webb had shot Thomas, had filed report corroborating Webb's false account of shooting, despite knowing it was perjury that covered up murder. His death sent message that witnesses to Thomas's killing wouldn't escape accountability, even if Treasury Department refused to investigate obvious murder disguised as justified law enforcement action. Revenue agent James Bradford died November 11th, shot while walking to his vehicle outside boarding house, where agents stayed during Pike County enforcement operations. Bradford had been second agent present during raid, had helped search White homestead after shooting, had stolen personal property that exceeded what was legally permissible seizure of moonshine-related equipment. His death eliminated another witness to Thomas's murder, while demonstrating that agents weren't safe, even in populated areas where they'd believed numbers and visibility would protect them from retaliation. Agent William Morrison died November 14th during solo patrol of mountain roads, ambushed by shooter positioned on ridge overlooking route that revenue agents traveled regularly. Morrison had been third agent present during raid, had made threatening comments to Rosa after shooting about what happened to widows whose husbands couldn't protect them from federal authority, implicit sexual threat that Rosa had neither forgotten nor forgiven. His death was particularly brutal, multiple gunshot wounds suggesting rage beyond simple elimination, personal nature of violence indicating that Rosa remembered specific offenses each agent had committed, beyond their collective responsibility for Thomas's murder. Marcus Webb died November 16th, 2 weeks after murdering Thomas White, shot through heart in precisely the same location where his bullet had killed unarmed man defending family from what had appeared to be home invasion rather than legitimate law enforcement operation. Webb's body was discovered on White property near where he'd killed Thomas. Deliberate placement that made Rosa's message unmistakable. She was delivering justice for her husband's murder by eliminating agent who'd pulled trigger and who'd filed false report claiming justified shooting when witnesses confirmed it had been murder. Webb's death transformed enforcement operation from routine moonshine raids to federal manhunt. Treasury Department assigning additional agents to Pike County, while warning surviving officers that they were targets of systematic campaign that had already claimed 4 lives, including Operations Commanding Agent. Additional agents died throughout late November. Despite heightened security and defensive measures, federal officers had implemented after recognizing they were being hunted systematically. 2 agents were killed November 19th during patrol they'd conducted in pair specifically to prevent ambushes that had eliminated officers operating alone. Caught in crossfire from multiple positions that suggested single shooter moving rapidly between concealed locations. Tactical sophistication that agents hadn't anticipated from Mountain Widow they'd assumed was grief-stricken rather than calculating their systematic elimination. 3 more died November 22nd when their vehicle was disabled by gunfire, and they were picked off individually while attempting to seek cover. Systematic violence that demonstrated Rosa could strike anywhere, regardless of security precautions agents had implemented. By November 25th, 13 revenue agents were dead. Treasury Department had suspended all enforcement operations in Pike County. Surviving agent had requested transfer, rather than remain in region where colleague after colleague had been eliminated by unknown assailant, whose systematic campaign had forced acknowledgement that moonshine enforcement wasn't worth losing. Entire enforcement team to violence that authorities couldn't prevent or solve, despite knowing that Thomas White's widow was likely perpetrator given that. Killings had begun immediately after his murder, and had targeted specific agents who'd participated in raid or harassment preceding it. But Treasury Department couldn't prove Rosa's involvement, despite strong suspicions, had no witnesses placing her at any murder scenes, had no physical evidence connecting her to weapons used or locations where shootings had occurred, couldn't arrest grieving widow without evidence that would support prosecution when community throughout Pike County would support her regardless of whether she was guilty. The final killing occurred November 28th, when last remaining revenue agent assigned to Pike County operation was found dead outside county courthouse, where he'd been filing final reports before permanent transfer that would remove him from region where 13 colleagues had been eliminated. His death completed Rosa's systematic elimination of entire enforcement team that had murdered her husband and terrorized her community, demonstrated that federal agents couldn't escape accountability even when leaving area after acknowledging that enforcement was impossible without unacceptable casualties. The message was unmistakable. Rosa White had avenged her husband's murder through systematic violence that had forced Treasury Department to withdraw completely from Pike County moonshine enforcement during final month before Prohibition's repeal would eliminate legal justification for revenue operations that had claimed Thomas White's life and had cost 14 federal agents their own lives in. Widow's systematic campaign of retribution. Treasury Department investigation deployed over 50 agents to Pike County in December 1933, established command post with armed security, offered unprecedented $10,000 reward for information leading to arrest of person or persons responsible for 14 agents' deaths. But mountain community remained completely silent, refused to cooperate with investigation, despite generous reward and despite threats of federal prosecution for harboring fugitives or obstructing justice, understood that Rosa White had delivered justice. That legal system had denied when Thomas's murder had been ruled justified shooting, despite witness testimony proving it had been federal agents' crime rather than lawful enforcement action. Federal investigators interviewed Rosa directly, confronted her with circumstantial evidence suggesting her involvement, found her responses consistent with grieving widow who'd lost husband to government violence and who possessed neither capability nor motivation for systematic elimination of 14 trained federal agents across 26-day period. Rosa maintained perfect composure during interrogations, never wavered from position that she was devastated by husband's murder and disturbed by subsequent violence, but that she knew nothing about who was responsible for agents' deaths, that she'd been home caring for children and managing farm throughout November, while mourning Thomas and attempting to maintain family's economic survival without primary breadwinner. Investigators found no witnesses placing her near any murder scenes, no physical evidence connecting her to weapons or ammunition used in killings, no breaks in her daily routines that would have allowed extended absences necessary for conducting surveillance and executing systematic elimination campaign. The investigation's failure to develop prosecutable case, despite strong circumstantial evidence, meant Rosa would never be charged, despite being likely perpetrator, whose motives and capabilities matched profile of systematic violence that had eliminated every agent involved in her husband's murder. Prohibition's repeal on December 5, 1933, eliminated legal prohibition of alcohol production, rendered moonshine enforcement politically irrelevant rather than simply administratively impossible, as Rosa's campaign had demonstrated in Pike County. Treasury Department quietly closed investigation in January 1934, acknowledged that prosecution was unlikely given lack of evidence and community's comprehensive refusal to cooperate, accepted that 14 agents' deaths would remain officially unsolved, despite everyone understanding that Thomas White's widow had delivered retribution that legal system had denied when federal murder had been ruled justified law enforcement action. The outcome represented unprecedented failure of federal authority. Admission that systematic civil rights violations and extrajudicial killing of Mountain Man had triggered response that Treasury Department couldn't prevent or punish. That badges provided no protection when agents violated basic constitutional protections and then murdered citizen who'd attempted to defend his family from what appeared to be armed home invasion. Rosa White lived quietly on her homestead through remaining years, never remarried, devoted herself to raising her children and maintaining property that Thomas had defended with his life before being shot by revenue agent who'd terrorized families throughout Pike County for 3 years before escalating harassment to lethal violence. She died in 1958 at age 66, pneumonia, taking her during particularly harsh winter, buried beside Thomas in cemetery, where both their ancestors had been interred across multiple generations. Her obituary in local newspaper mentioned she'd been widow of Thomas White, killed during troubles with federal agents in 1933, without specifying that she'd personally eliminated 14 revenue agents who'd murdered her husband and terrorized her community. Euphemistic language reflecting mountain culture's code of silence about violence against government authority that had systematically violated constitutional rights and basic decency. Rosa's role in systematic elimination of 14 revenue agents was never officially acknowledged during her lifetime, remained subject of speculation and legend throughout Pike County, where residents understood she'd delivered justice but maintained public silence about what everyone knew privately. Her children and grandchildren inherited Homestead, where both Thomas's murder and Rosa's retribution had occurred, maintained property that had become symbolic of Mountain family's resistance to federal overreach and willingness to defend honor through violence when legal system failed to provide justice for obvious wrongs that authorities preferred to cover up rather than investigate honestly. The legacy persists in debates about gender and violence, about capability of women to conduct systematic military-style campaigns when motivated by family protection and justice denied, about whether Rosa's elimination of 14 agents was justified response to husband's murder and years of harassment, or whether killing federal officers could never be defended, regardless of civil rights violations that had triggered widow's vengeance. The case demonstrated that assumptions about women's capacity for sustained violence were fundamentally wrong, that Mountain Widow possessed skills and determination that male agents had never anticipated, that underestimating opponents based on gender stereotypes could have fatal consequences when victims of injustice possessed both capability and motivation to deliver retribution through systematic elimination that authorities couldn't prevent or punish. The decades following Rosa White's systematic elimination of 14 revenue agents in 1933 brought unprecedented code of silence throughout Pike County, community-wide conspiracy to protect woman who'd delivered justice that legal system had denied when husband's murder had been ruled justified shooting, despite witnesses confirming it had been federal agents' crime. The silence wasn't passive acceptance, but active protection, residents deliberately creating false alibis and misdirecting investigators and refusing cooperation with federal authorities whose agents had terrorized families for years before murdering Thomas White and triggering widow's retribution. The community's protection of Rosa represented collective judgment, that her violence had been justified defense of family honor and appropriate response to systematic civil rights violations that had culminated in home invasion and murder disguised as legitimate law enforcement operation. Treasury Department's investigation throughout 1934 encountered absolute refusal to cooperate, despite generous $10,000 reward that represented fortune during Depression, when most Pike County families survived on annual incomes below $500. Federal investigators interviewed hundreds of residents, found universal claims that they knew nothing about 14 agents' deaths, encountered deliberate obfuscation when they attempted to establish Rosa's whereabouts during November 1933. Neighbors testified she'd been home continuously caring for children and managing farm, provided detailed accounts of seeing her daily at homestead when actual timeline would have required extended absences, for conducting surveillance and executing systematic elimination campaign. The false testimony was coordinated conspiracy, mountain community deciding collectively that protecting Rosa White was more important than cooperating with federal authorities whose agents had murdered her husband and terrorized families through years of illegal harassment. The investigation's failure reflected not just community silence, but fundamental weaknesses in Treasury Department's capabilities during 1930s, when federal law enforcement lacked sophisticated investigative techniques that later eras would develop. Agents had no ballistic databases to match bullets from 14 murder scenes, no fingerprint analysis that could connect Rosa to weapons or locations, no surveillance technology that could document her movements or prove she'd been near murder sites when killings occurred. The investigation relied on witness testimony and physical evidence that community successfully concealed through collective conspiracy. Protecting Rosa through systematic campaign of false statements and evidence destruction that was itself federal crime, but that no prosecutor could prove when everyone maintained unified position that they knew nothing beyond rumors and speculation. Federal investigators suspected Rosa was guilty, but couldn't overcome reasonable doubt that any prosecution would face when entire community provided alibi testimony and when physical evidence connecting her to murders simply didn't exist because she'd been meticulous about avoiding detection during systematic elimination campaign. Lead investigator Special Agent Robert Harrison acknowledged in his final report filed June 1934 that Rosa White was likely perpetrator, but that prosecution was impossible without witnesses or evidence. That community's comprehensive refusal to cooperate meant case would remain unsolved, despite strong circumstantial evidence suggesting widow had delivered retribution for husband's murder through violence that had eliminated every agent involved in Thomas White's killing and preceding years of harassment. Rosa maintained perfect composure throughout investigation, never wavered from position that she'd been devastated by husband's murder and disturbed by subsequent violence, but knew nothing about who was responsible, that she'd been focused on caring for children and maintaining farm during November 1933, while mourning Thomas and attempting to survive economically without primary breadwinner. Her performance during interrogations was masterful demonstration of mountain woman's capability for deception when protecting family interests, ability to maintain consistent narrative under pressure from trained federal investigators who suspected but couldn't prove her guilt. Rosa understood that admitting nothing and maintaining grief-stricken widow persona was safest strategy. That federal agents expected women to be emotional and vulnerable rather than calculating and dangerous, that their gender stereotypes about violence would work in her favor as long as she never revealed capabilities that had enabled systematic elimination of 14 trained agents across a 26-day period. The investigation's closure in January 1935 represented unprecedented federal failure, acknowledgement that Treasury Department couldn't prosecute women who'd eliminated 14 revenue agents through systematic violence that community had unanimously decided was justified response to husband's murder and years of civil rights violations. The outcome established precedent that federal authority had limits when populations refused cooperation, that badges provided no protection when agents violated constitutional rights and murdered citizens who'd attempted to defend families from what appeared to be armed invasions rather than legitimate law enforcement operations. The closure meant Rosa would never face trial, despite being widely known throughout Pike County as woman who'd killed 14 federal agents, that she'd spend remaining 23 years of life as free woman, protected by community's collective decision that her violence had been appropriate response to systematic government abuse that had culminated in Thomas's murder. Rosa's life after investigation's closure was quiet devotion to raising children and maintaining homestead that Thomas had defended with his life before being shot by revenue agent who'd terrorized Pike County families for 3 years. Her 3 sons, William, age 22, James, age 19, and Robert, age 17 in 1934, had all offered to avenge their father's death, but Rosa had insisted on handling retribution personally, protecting sons from consequences that she was willing to accept because her life was already shaped by Thomas's murder, while theirs still held possibilities that violence against federal agents would eliminate. The sons understood their mother had killed 14 revenue agents, though she never explicitly acknowledged it, maintained within family same code of silence that community practiced publicly, creating situation where everyone knew truth, but no one spoke it even in private conversations where federal investigators couldn't overhear. Rosa's daughter Sarah, age 14 in 1933, had witnessed Thomas's murder alongside her mother, had been present when Webb had shot unarmed husband and father in their home without proper announcement, had heard revenue agents make sexual threats about what happened to women whose men couldn't protect them from federal authority. Sarah's trauma from witnessing father's murder and hearing agents' threatening comments shaped her understanding of Rosa's subsequent violence as justified maternal protection rather than criminal vengeance, made her fierce defender of mother's actions throughout life, even while never publicly acknowledging Rosa had personally eliminated 14 federal agents. Sarah would later describe her mother as strongest woman I ever knew, did what needed doing when men with badges thought Mountain Widow could be terrorized without consequences. The White family homestead became symbolic location throughout Pike County, site where Thomas had been murdered and where Rosa had begun systematic elimination campaign that had forced Treasury Department to withdraw completely from moonshine enforcement in region. Neighbors would point out property to visitors, tell stories about widow who'd avenged husband's death through violence that male federal agents had never anticipated, from woman they'd dismissed as harmless grieving mother. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling, transformed Rosa into legendary figure whose capabilities exceeded even actual impressive reality of eliminating 14 trained agents through 26-day campaign that authorities couldn't prevent or solve. Rosa herself discouraged the mythologizing, maintained modest demeanor, consistent with mountain culture's values about not boasting about violence, even when community celebrated actions as justified resistance to government overreach. Rosa's relationship with law enforcement remained complex throughout remaining years, local sheriff understanding she'd killed 14 federal agents, but respecting community's judgment that violence had been appropriate response to husband's murder and years of harassment. Sheriff Tom Belcher had known Thomas White personally, had attended funeral where over 200 mourners had gathered to honor man murdered by revenue agent, had heard witnesses describe how Webb had shot unarmed homeowner defending family from what appeared to be armed invasion. Belcher's private opinion, shared quietly with trusted residents but never officially recorded, was that Rosa had delivered justice that federal system had denied, that her systematic elimination of 14 agents had been understandable if not technically legal response to circumstances where Thomas's murder had been ruled justified despite obvious evidence of wrongdoing. The economic impact of Rosa's violence extended beyond immediate elimination of 14 revenue agents to lasting effect on federal enforcement throughout eastern Kentucky. Treasury Department's withdrawal from Pike County moonshine operations became permanent policy rather than temporary response to casualties, acknowledgement that attempting enforcement in regions where populations supported moonshine families over federal authority would cost more agents than government was willing to sacrifice. The withdrawal meant Pike County families could operate stills without federal interference throughout 1930s and 1940s, generating income that sustained mountain economy when coal mining provided insufficient employment and when legal alternatives barely existed during Depression and war years. Rosa's violence had created de facto exemption from federal alcohol enforcement, protected communities' economic survival through systematic elimination that had demonstrated federal authorities' limits when populations refused cooperation and when victims of government abuse possessed capability for retribution that authorities couldn't prevent. But Rosa's violence also carried permanent costs that community mythologizing often overlooked. 14 federal agents had left behind widows and children who suffered economic devastation, similar to what Rosa experienced when Thomas was murdered. The agents' families had no community support, had instead faced knowledge that their husbands and fathers had died pursuing enforcement operation in region that celebrated their killer as hero, defending family honor and mountain sovereignty. Treasury Department provided minimal death benefits that couldn't replace breadwinners' incomes, left families struggling financially while Rosa became legendary figure honored throughout Pike County for violence that had destroyed families on all sides of tragedy, where both federal agents' misconduct and widows' retribution had created suffering extending far beyond immediate participants. Elizabeth Webb, widow of Revenue Agent Marcus Webb, who'd shot Thomas White and who'd been killed by Rosa 16 days later, struggled particularly with conflicting emotions about husband whose murder of unarmed homeowner had triggered systematic violence that had ultimately claimed his own life along with 13 colleagues. Elizabeth had 3 children under age 10, had believed her husband was serving his country by enforcing federal laws against illegal alcohol, hadn't known about his aggressive tactics and threatening behavior toward mountain families until Treasury investigation had exposed pattern of civil rights violations and harassment that had preceded Thomas White's murder. She'd received Webb's false report claiming justified shooting, had believed her husband had acted in self-defense against armed subject resisting legitimate enforcement, had only learned truth when witnesses testified during investigation that Webb had shot unarmed man defending family from unannounced forced entry that had appeared to be home invasion rather than lawful raid. Elizabeth wrote letter to Rosa in 1936, unprecedented communication between widow of murdered husband and widow of agent who'd committed murder, asked whether Rosa could help her understand why Marcus had been so aggressive in Pike County enforcement, whether something had happened to transform man. She'd thought she knew into agent, whose tactics had violated civil rights and terrorized families. Rosa responded with carefully worded letter, acknowledging Elizabeth's suffering, while explaining that Marcus had chosen tactics that violated basic decency, that his murder of Thomas had been inevitable consequence of systematic harassment campaign that had escalated to lethal violence when homeowner had attempted to defend family from what appeared to be armed invasion. The correspondence continued sporadically through 1938, 2 widows attempting to understand tragedy that had destroyed both their lives, finding common ground in recognition that federal policies and individual choices had combined to create a situation where violence seemed necessary to both sides, even though neither could adequately justify costs that retribution had imposed on innocent families. The correspondence ended when Elizabeth remarried in 1939, moved away from Virginia, where she'd lived during Marcus's employment with Treasury Department, sought fresh start in region where her association with revenue agent killed in Kentucky wouldn't follow her and her children. Her final letter to Rosa acknowledged that she'd come to understand Marcus bore responsibility for initiating violence through his harassment and murder of Thomas White, that Rosa's retribution had been comprehensible, if not justifiable, response to circumstances where legal system had failed to investigate obvious wrongdoing, that neither could fully defend actions taken by their husbands, but both could understand how circumstances had created tragedy affecting innocent people on all sides. Rosa's health declined gradually through 1950s. Years of outdoor work and stress from maintaining farm, without Thomas's help taking toll on strength and endurance, that had once enabled systematic elimination campaign requiring physical capability and tactical sophistication that 14 male federal agents had fatally underestimated. She developed chronic respiratory problems, likely from exposure during herb-gathering expeditions that had continued throughout life, as she'd maintained practice as community healer, using traditional mountain medicine to treat neighbors who couldn't afford doctors or who preferred Rosa's remedies to modern medical interventions. Her role as healer created cognitive dissonance for some residents who understood she'd killed 14 men, while also devoting life to helping sick and injured, paradox of woman, whose violence coexisted with caregiving traditionally associated with feminine nurturing rather than military-style systematic elimination campaigns. Rosa White died February 12, 1958, at age 66. Pneumonia developed during particularly harsh winter, claiming her despite daughter Sarah's devoted nursing care and community's collective prayers for woman who'd become symbol of mountain resistance to federal overreach. Her funeral drew over 500 mourners from throughout Pike County and neighboring regions, testament to legendary status she'd achieved through avenging husband's murder and protecting communities' economic survival through systematic violence that had forced federal withdrawal from moonshine enforcement. Multiple speakers delivered eulogies celebrating her as devoted wife and mother, who defended family honor when legal system had failed, carefully worded tributes that never explicitly acknowledged she'd killed 14 federal agents, but that everyone understood referenced November 1933 events that had shaped her life and regional history. Sarah White delivered final eulogy, describing mother's strength and determination, acknowledged publicly for first time that Rosa had taken actions necessary to defend family after Thomas's murder, stopped just short of admitting systematic elimination campaign, but made clear that mother had been responsible for events that had forced federal withdrawal from Pike County. Sarah's frankness was controversial, even at funeral attended by residents who'd known Rosa's role for 25 years, some believing that explicit acknowledgement violated code of silence that had protected Rosa during investigation and that should continue protecting her memory after death. But Sarah argued that mother deserved public recognition for courage and capability that had enabled systematic violence defending family and community, that maintaining silence after Rosa's death meant allowing history to forget woman, whose actions had demonstrated that underestimating mountain widows based on gender stereotypes carried fatal consequences for male federal agents who'd believed women incapable of military-style campaigns. Rosa was buried beside Thomas in cemetery on Homestead, where both had lived, and where Thomas had died defending family from revenue agent, whose murder of unarmed homeowner had triggered widow's retribution. The gravestone was simple marker listing names and dates without reference to November 1933 events that had defined their lives and deaths, reflecting mountain culture's preference for understated memorials that avoided boasting about violence, even when communities celebrated actions as justified resistance. But visitors to cemetery would gather at gravesite, tell stories about widow who'd killed 14 federal agents, transform Rosa into folk hero, whose legendary status grew with each retelling, until separating actual events from embellished narratives became impossible for those who hadn't lived through 1933 and didn't know truth from community's collective memory. The 1960s brought social changes that gradually eroded conditions enabling Rosa's violence and community's protection of her actions. Federal law enforcement developing capabilities that would have made systematic elimination campaign much more difficult to execute and conceal. Advances in forensic science, including improved ballistics analysis and fingerprint databases, meant that Rosa's careful avoidance of physical evidence wouldn't have been sufficient in later era, that connecting her to 14 murder scenes would have been possible through techniques unavailable to 1934 investigators. More significantly, civil rights movement and changing attitudes about government authority meant that communities became less united in refusing cooperation with federal investigations, that protecting individual perpetrators of violence against law enforcement became more controversial as populations developed more complex relationships with federal authority that mixed resistance with accommodation, depending on specific circumstances and policies involved. But 1960s changes also brought renewed interest in Rosa's story, as feminist movement began examining women's capacity for violence and challenging assumptions about gender and aggression that had enabled Rosa's success by causing male federal agents to underestimate widow they'd dismissed as harmless, grief-stricken mother. Historian Patricia Morrison published first comprehensive study in 1968 titled The Mountain Widow, Rosa White and America's Deadliest Female Attack on Law Enforcement, documenting November 1933 events through interviews with surviving community members and examination of Treasury Department files that had been declassified after mandatory 30-year retention period. Morrison's research confirmed what Pike County residents had always known. Rosa had personally eliminated 14 revenue agents through systematic campaign requiring tactical sophistication and sustained violence that challenged prevailing assumptions about women's capabilities and motivations when defending families from perceived threats. Morrison's most significant finding came from Treasury files, showing that Special Agent Robert Harrison had recommended in 1934 that Rosa be prosecuted despite lack of direct evidence, arguing that her obvious guilt shouldn't be protected by community silence and evidentiary weaknesses when 14 federal agents had been killed through systematic violence. Harrison's recommendation had been overruled by Treasury Department leadership, who'd concluded that prosecution would fail and would generate additional publicity about civil rights violations, and Thomas White's murder that department preferred to keep buried. That accepting 14 agents' deaths without accountability was preferable to trial that would expose institutional failures and Webb's aggressive tactics that had triggered Widow's retribution. The revelation demonstrated that Justice Department had consciously chosen protecting institutional reputation over pursuing accountability for 14 murders, had effectively granted Rosa immunity because prosecuting her would have required acknowledging that federal agents' misconduct had created circumstances making violence comprehensible even to juries who generally supported law enforcement. Morrison's book generated controversy throughout Kentucky, law enforcement organizations condemning it as glorification of cop killing and attack on fallen agents whose deaths deserved honoring rather than examination of institutional failures that had contributed to tragedy. But feminist scholars embraced research as evidence that women possessed capability for systematic violence, equal to men's when motivated by family protection and justice denied. That gender stereotypes about women's passivity and emotional vulnerability were social constructs rather than biological limitations, that Rosa White had demonstrated that underestimating women based on assumptions about femininity could have fatal consequences when female opponents possessed skills and determination that male authorities had never anticipated. The debate transformed Rosa from regional legend to national symbol in emerging discussions about gender and violence, her story becoming case study examined in women's studies courses and feminist literature, exploring how patriarchal assumptions limited recognition of women's full range of capabilities, including sustained aggression when circumstances demanded violence for survival or justice. Rosa's daughter Sarah died in 1974 at age 55, cancer taking her before she could complete oral history project documenting mother's life and November 1933 events that had shaped family's history. Sarah had begun recording interviews with surviving community members in early 1970s, gathering first-hand accounts of Thomas's murder and Rosa's systematic elimination campaign, attempting to create comprehensive record before witnesses died, and direct knowledge of events was lost to historical record. Her death meant oral history remained incomplete, scattered recordings and notes that Sarah's own children inherited without fully understanding their significance or having capability to complete project their mother had begun. The incomplete oral history represented lost opportunity to document Rosa's perspective and motivations directly from family sources, left historians dependent on Treasury files and community legends that often conflicted or embellished actual events. Rosa's 3 sons survived into 1980s and 1990s, lived full lives in Pike County, where they'd been raised, and where mother's legendary status had opened doors throughout region, even while never being explicitly acknowledged. William died 1983 at age 71, James 1989 at 74, Robert 1996 at 79. Each maintained throughout life the same code of silence that community had practiced, never publicly acknowledged that mother had killed 14 revenue agents, though their pride in her actions was obvious to anyone who knew family history. Their obituaries mentioned they were sons of Rosa and Thomas White, without reference to November 1933 events, continuing pattern of euphemistic language that avoided explicit celebration of violence, while allowing community to remember and honor actions that regional culture viewed as justified resistance to federal overreach. The 21st century brought final chapters in Rosa White's story when documentary filmmaker Jennifer Harrison produced comprehensive examination of November 1933 events from multiple perspectives. The Mountain Widow, Rosa White's War Against Federal Agents, premiered in 2010, featured interviews with historians, including Patricia Morrison, with Rosa's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, describing family legacy and burden of being associated with women who'd killed 14 federal agents, with descendants of dead revenue agents expressing continuing anger that their grandfather's killer had never been prosecuted and had been celebrated as hero throughout Pike County. The documentary presented most balanced account possible, given competing narratives, acknowledged both federal agents' civil rights violations and Rosa's systematic violence as components of tragedy where multiple parties bore responsibility for outcomes that had destroyed innocent lives on all sides. Most powerful segment featured joint interview with Martha White, age 68 in 2010, and Rosa's granddaughter through son William, and Thomas Webb, age 72, grandson of revenue agent Marcus Webb, who'd shot Thomas White and had been killed by Rosa. Martha defended great-grandmother's actions as necessary response to husband's murder, and years of harassment that legal system had refused to investigate maintained that eliminating 14 agents had been only way to deliver justice when Treasury Department had ruled obvious murder as justified shooting. Thomas described how great-grandfather's death had destroyed family economically and emotionally, how learning details of Marcus's aggressive tactics and Thomas White's murder had complicated understanding of whether great-grandfather bore responsibility for tragedy or had been victim of institutional failures beyond his individual control. The exchange revealed unbridgeable gap between competing perspectives, Martha unable to acknowledge that great-grandmother's systematic violence had inflicted permanent harm on innocent families whose breadwinners had died pursuing enforcement operations in region that celebrated their killer. Thomas unable to accept that his great-grandfather's misconduct had created circumstances where widow's violence seemed necessary response to murder disguised as legitimate law enforcement. Documentary director Harrison explained in commentary that she'd hoped interview would demonstrate possibility of reconciliation between families affected by November 1933 events, but instead it had revealed that 77 years wasn't sufficient time for healing wounds created when federal agents had murdered Mountain Man and when Widow had systematically eliminated every agent involved in raid and preceding harassment campaign. The documentary's most controversial revelation came from newly discovered Treasury Department files showing that several agents killed by Rosa had opposed Marcus Webb's aggressive tactics, had filed internal complaints about civil rights violations and harassment of Mountain families, had participated in November 2nd raid reluctantly because refusing orders would have ended their careers. The information complicated narrative that all 14 agents bore equal responsibility for Thomas's murder, and preceding harassment suggested Rosa's systematic elimination hadn't discriminated between those primarily responsible for misconduct and those following orders they'd privately opposed. Families of agents who'd filed complaints expressed particular anger that their grandfathers had died, despite trying to prevent exactly the kind of aggressive enforcement that had triggered Rosa's violence, argued that Widow's retribution had been indiscriminate revenge rather than targeted justice against those most culpable for husband's murder. The revelations sparked debate among Rosa's descendants and supporters about whether great-grandmother's violence had exceeded legitimate response to Thomas's murder, whether killing agents who'd opposed Webb's tactics demonstrated that systematic elimination had been motivated partly by revenge rather than purely by defensive necessity or pursuit of justice. Martha White defended Rosa's decision to eliminate all 14 agents, argued that everyone who'd participated in harassment campaign bore collective responsibility regardless of individual reservations, that allowing some to survive because they'd privately opposed tactics would have left witnesses who could have testified about Rosa's identity and methods. But Martha's cousin, Rebecca White, 58-year-old history professor at University of Kentucky, published response essay challenging families' traditional narrative of justified resistance, argued that killing agents who'd opposed Webb's misconduct demonstrated Rosa's violence, had exceeded proportional response to circumstances, even while acknowledging that husband's murder had created impossible situation where no reaction would have been adequate or just. Rebecca's essay created controversy within White family, older members viewing her as traitor, undermining great-grandmother's legacy, and dishonoring memory of woman who'd defended family honor through violence that had required extraordinary courage and capability. But younger generation largely supported Rebecca's willingness to acknowledge moral complexity, argued that honoring Rosa required confronting, rather than celebrating violence that had destroyed innocent families, even while recognizing that systematic elimination had been motivated by husband's murder and years of civil rights violations that legal system had refused to address. The generational divide reflected broader changes in how violence against government authority was evaluated, younger descendants more willing to question heroic narratives, while older family members maintained traditional position that Rosa's actions had been completely justified response to federal agents' misconduct. The tension within White family reached crisis in 2015 when Pike County Historical Society proposed memorial at White Homestead site honoring both Thomas White and 14 revenue agents killed in November 1933, controversial project that would acknowledge both husband's murder and widow's systematic retaliation, while attempting to recognize suffering on all sides of tragedy where institutional failures and individual choices had combined to create violence, destroying multiple families. Proposed memorial would include names of all 15 men who died, Thomas plus 14 agents, alongside description of events that had triggered violence and that had ultimately forced federal withdrawal from Pike County moonshine enforcement. Martha White opposed memorial, argued it would equate Thomas's murder with agents' deaths when circumstances were fundamentally different. That homeowner defending family from unannounced forced entry couldn't be morally equivalent to federal agents who'd systematically violated civil rights and who'd killed unarmed man they'd been harassing for years. Rebecca White supported memorial, maintained that honoring all victims didn't excuse anyone's conduct, but acknowledged that families on all sides had suffered permanent losses regardless of who bore primary responsibility for initiating tragedy, that 15 deaths deserved recognition, even while historical record documented that federal agents' misconduct had triggered widows' retribution. Memorial was approved in 2016 over some family objections, installed at White Homestead, with dedication ceremony deliberately scheduled for November 2nd, 83rd anniversary of Thomas's murder, and beginning of Rosa's systematic elimination campaign. Ceremony included representatives from agents' families reading names of 14 men who died in November 1933, Rosa's great-grandchildren reading Thomas's name and acknowledging that great-grandmother had delivered justice through violence that legal system had denied, but that had destroyed innocent families whose breadwinners had left widows and children struggling economically. The event received regional media coverage, presented as community attempting to acknowledge complex tragedy, where simplified heroic or villainous narratives failed to capture reality of events, where both systematic civil rights violations and systematic violence had created suffering extending far beyond immediate participants. By 2024, Rosa White's homestead had become minor pilgrimage site for feminists and activists interested in women's capacity for violence and resistance to government authority, location where visitors could stand where widow had watched husband murdered by revenue agent, and where she'd begun planning systematic elimination campaign that would claim 14 agents' lives across 26 days. Tour guides presented balanced narrative, acknowledging both Rosa's remarkable tactical capabilities and the moral complexity of violence that had been motivated by husband's murder, but that had killed agents whose individual culpability varied significantly, some having actively participated in harassment, while others had reluctantly followed orders they'd privately opposed. The homestead's historical marker captured irreducible complexity. On this property, Thomas White was shot dead by revenue agent Marcus Webb on November 2, 1933, during raid conducted without warrant or proper announcement. His widow Rosa White subsequently killed 14 federal agents, including all participants in raid and agents involved in preceding 3 years of harassment. Her systematic elimination campaign forced federal withdrawal from Pike County enforcement and demonstrated that underestimating Mountain Widow's capability for sustained violence based on gender stereotypes could have fatal consequences. This site reminds us that institutional failures creating injustice can trigger responses that themselves create injustice. That defending family honor through violence destroys innocent families on all sides, and that women's capacity for systematic military-style campaigns challenges assumptions about gender and aggression that persist despite historical evidence, proving such assumptions dangerously wrong. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of Rosa White's legacy across 90 years, the gender stereotypes that enabled her success and that continue limiting recognition of women's full capabilities, including violence, the federal agents' misconduct that triggered widows' retribution, and the innocent families destroyed by that retribution, the community's decades-long conspiracy protecting women they judged had delivered justice that legal system denied. The generational divisions about whether systematic elimination of 14 agents was justified response or excessive revenge, the impossible questions about whether violence that seemed necessary in 1933 can be celebrated in 2024 when moral standards have evolved. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories that challenge assumptions about gender and violence, that force examination of how women's capacity for systematic aggression has been systematically underestimated throughout history, with fatal consequences for male authorities who dismissed female opponents based on stereotypes, that acknowledge both justified resistance to government overreach and unjustified destruction of innocent families when violence becomes indiscriminate revenge rather than targeted justice. Comment about whether Rosa was hero defending family honor or murderer who killed agents attempting to withdraw from operations they'd opposed. Whether memorial honoring all 15 victims appropriately acknowledges complexity or inappropriately equates Thomas's murder with agents' deaths during retribution. Whether Martha or Rebecca better honors great-grandmother's memory through defending all actions versus acknowledging moral complexity. Whether feminists should celebrate Rosa as symbol of women's capability or critique violence that destroyed families regardless of gender of perpetrator. Because these questions persist wherever women's violence is analyzed, wherever assumptions about gender limit recognition of female agency and capability including sustained aggression when circumstances demand violence, wherever government misconduct triggers responses that themselves create injustice, wherever descendants must decide whether honoring ancestors requires defending all actions, or whether integrity demands acknowledging that heroism and tragedy can coexist in same person, whose violence defended family while destroying others. Until next time, remember that Rosa White killed 14 federal agents to avenge husband, murdered by revenue agent, who'd terrorized families for years, that male agents fatally underestimated widow's capability based on gender stereotypes about violence, that some agents she killed had opposed misconduct that triggered her retribution, that community protected her through decades-long conspiracy of silence, that her story challenges fundamental assumptions about women and violence that persist despite historical evidence, proving such assumptions dangerously wrong, and that ultimately, Rosa White demonstrates that women's capacity for systematic military-style campaigns equals men's when motivated by family protection and justice denied. That underestimating female opponents based on gender carries same fatal consequences as underestimating any opponent, and that her legacy forces examination of whether violence defending family can be celebrated when that violence destroys other families whose members bore varying degrees of responsibility for injustices that triggered widow's systematic elimination campaign.